Thank you for joining. As Ed and Mike has said, my name is Ken Hutton. I'm the product development manager for our herbicides and fungicides, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you this afternoon about weed control, weed management. And I realize there are several regions of the country being represented today, and that's great. I certainly am not going to cover every single weed that you face, but hopefully I will cover a representative population of what you face. I'll address some weeds that aren't in here just to use them as examples, but as Ed mentioned, if you have a specific question about a weed that I may not mention that you're having issues with, feel free to put that in the Q&A box and we can address that later on. In true FMC fashion, we'll start with a safety share. And as we're talking about herbicides, you can't have a herbicide discussion without mentioning the label. I'm going to get this out here. There we go. Labels tell you a ton of information all about the product, where it can be used, how it should be used safely and effectively, how to store the product. It has emergency contact information on the label, precautionary statements, all of these things. So please pay attention to the label. Make sure you're regularly referencing these labels, keeping up to date with those labels, and then checking the manufacturer's website to make sure you have the most up-to-date label. Because as we know, the label is the law. It can be enforced. So please pay attention to that. All right. So we'll continue on, and every single weed control talk has to start this way. Okay. What is a weed? You've heard this many times. Okay. Plant out of place, plant growing where it's not wanted, that kind of thing. I like the more elegant definitions, with Ralph Waldo Emerson, is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. So let's use that to explain to your customers what you're doing. How about that? And then as far as a formal definition, the Weed Science Society of America defines a weed as a plant that causes economical losses, ecological damage, creates health problems for humans, animals, or is undesirable where it is growing. So there's no economic value to that plant. And at the end of the day, the weed is defined by a person. So even a turf grass, if you've got, say, for example, Bermuda grass growing into St. Augustine grass, in two different situations, they're desirable turf species. But when you combine them, not so much. One's a headache, and then you end up resodding and more aggressive treatment options. So those are types of things that we think about when we're talking about weeds. There's a lot of different weed types out there as far as how they're characterized by their life cycle. You have annual life cycles or annual weed species. The upper right corner here, this is a picture of a goosegrass plant. That's an example of a summer annual. Down here, we have purple dead nettle and common chickweed. These are winter annuals. So they emerge differently depending upon where you are in the country. But typically an annual weed, its entire life cycle is going to be completed in that 1 year or one season. It emerges from seed, grows throughout vegetation growth in those environments that are conducive for that. For example, a summer weed, annual weed, is going to grow, typically germinate in the spring, grow throughout the summer. And as the days get shorter, that plant weakens, and then the frost comes along and naturally senesces. And then winter annuals are the opposite, right? So that's kind of what we think about. With annual weeds, they produce seed. Most of their energy and sole purpose is to produce seed for reproduction. That's where all their energy goes to when it comes to reproduction. Perennials, there are certainly several perennial weeds. These weeds typically to give us the most trouble when we're talking about managing weeds. This is an example here of a summer annual, Virginia buttonweed, very common in the southeast region, and is now creeping further north as we get into the mid-Atlantic areas. And then of course, dandelion and different species of dandelion can be found throughout the country. These weeds typically survive more than 2 years. They go through reproductive capabilities of producing a taproot or some type of underground structure that allows them to regenerate from that underground reproductive structure. They can produce seed, but typically their main mode of reproduction is coming back through from that taproot. For example, the dandelion, it can produce seed, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. And they typically will go dormant after a growing season, and then they'll reemerge the following season. So there is one more category called a biennial weed. We don't have a whole lot of biennial weed species in turfgrass, but examples would be something like wild carrot, or certain types of thistles can be considered biennial weeds. These basically takes 2 years for them to enter or complete their life cycle. We can further separate weeds, of course, as you get into different weed types. So you have grasses or grass weeds, broadleaf weeds, and grass-like weeds, or sedges and things of that nature. The main differences in identification characteristics that we talk about when it comes to grasses, and especially separating grass from a true dicot weed, it's parallel veins. You'll have leaves that are typically longer than wide, and the veins are going to be running in parallel with the length of that leaf. Typically will have some type of ligule, although not all grass species have ligules. There are certain species that don't have ligules. Not all grasses have auricles, but they'll have internodes, and there are certain weeds that will actually root at the nodes. Crabgrass is one of those that can do that. And then grasses certainly can have oval, round, or flat stems. And that's a really key characteristic in how to separate different grass types, because oftentimes you're not going to have a seed head to look at when you're trying to determine what type of grass you're dealing with. Sedges, or there's annual sedges and perennial sedges. Most of your annual sedges are going to be, all of your annual sedges, are going to be reproducing by seeds. They're going to have a very fibrous root system, whereas your perennial sedges and colingas are going to produce some type of underground reproductive structure, whether they be tubers in the case of perennial nut sedges, or rhizomes in the case of perennial colingas. They will also have parallel veins, but the big giveaway of a sedge species is the triangular shaped stem. Okay. And then you get into broadleaf weeds, and you get all these different characteristics as it relates to leaf shape, flower shape, and things of that nature. Whether they have a petiole or it's sessile or doesn't have a petiole. Typically, we pay attention to leaf arrangement when we're talking about common broadleaf weeds in turfgrass, as well as the leaf margin. Dandelion is a big one that we pay attention to there, but there's others that we can key on as well as we're talking about broadleaf weeds. So as we're developing a weed management program, certainly we're wanting to prevent weed introduction, right? We do our best to bring in clean sod if you're in a renovation setting or situation, or if there's weeds that are growing in the landscape beds. If that's a service that you provide, you make sure you're keeping the beds clean. If they've already formed seed heads, you can certainly try to cover up those seed heads as you're bagging them, taking them out, making sure they're not scattering seed in the lawns. Maintaining proper turf grass properly. I'm sure you've heard that before. A competitive turf grass is probably the foundational tool for establishing a successful weed control program. So all of that comes into play as far as mowing height, fertility. If there's an irrigation system in a homeowner's lawn or a customer's lawn, do what you can to educate them about proper irrigation. I know that can be challenging at times, but at least make the attempt to do that. Weed identification, of course, is important. We'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as cultural practices and things of that nature, to kind of really build it all together and use all your tools from an integrated pest management standpoint. If we look at herbicide types and classifications, kind of a general to specific type category, right? So you have your basic main categories are selective herbicides and non-selective herbicides. Selective herbicides, in its simplest definition, is it's going to kill the weed, leave the turf grass alone. Okay. Non-selective is going to kill everything that it comes in contact with, whether it's the turf grass or the weed in that lawn. So, glyphosate, glufosinate, those are some active ingredients that are considered non-selective options. Typically, those are products that are used along fence lines and things of that nature, or bare ground situations or paver patios, to get rid of those types of weeds. But that's kind of where they go. Then you can break those down further into pre-emergence herbicides and post-emergence herbicides. That's again more into the selective category. One thing that some people may not realize is about pre-emergence herbicides is that they don't actually prevent the weed seeds from germinating. Oftentimes, the weed seeds will actually germinate when they're still in that soil seed bank, because you're talking about the top, ½ inch of soil, right? But once that newly developed, meristematic tissue, or that new root that's being formed and trying to peg down, hits that herbicide layer, that's where the herbicide has its effect and prevents that weed from emerging. There's certain active ingredients actually where you'll see the weed emerge, but then it'll quickly die. A lot of times you'll see that with triazine herbicides, some of the HPPD inhibiting herbicides like mesotrione, those types of active ingredients. Sometimes you'll see those initial weed seedlings pop up out of the ground and then they'll quickly die back. So that's just kind of a little different way of understanding the pre-emergence herbicides. They establish that herbicide layer before those weeds emerge. I'm sure you've heard these terms before: the herbicide site of action and mode of action. Kind of to help better understand what that mean, or what these terms mean. The site of action is where that active ingredient, where that herbicide specifically binds to, that disrupts or inhibits a biochemical pathway. Or the mode of action kind of explains how that herbicide impacts the overall growth and development of the plant. So this is an example of a PPO inhibiting herbicide. The site of action is right here. This is if you remember back to your chemistry class days, enzymes are in these systems to basically be a catalyst, to move a reaction from one part to the next. So what a PPO inhibiting herbicide, in this case carfentrazone or quicksilver, comes in and it inhibits this formation of protogen, and it disrupts this we'll get it. It's PPO inhibiting herbicide. The protoporphyrinogen oxidase is what the actual enzyme that it inhibits. So that prevents this reaction to taking place, And the end result is you have these, what you call lipid peroxidation of those cell walls, which causes the cells to just deteriorate. And that's what we're seeing over here. Essentially, this area where you see the V, that's the vacuole. And over time, as you move from A panel over to the B to the C, you begin to see that vacuole become a little cloudy. And by the time it's in full effect, you see a lot of stuff floating around in the cytoplasm. The vacuole, and that's because all of those cells are being disrupted. The lipid peroxidation is occurring. The chloroplast here is starting to swell. And the end result is that plant begins to shut down because it can't produce chlorophyll. And what you end up seeing is something like this on the left. Okay, that's what we see when we spray Quicksilver or Dismiss NXT, or even Solitaire. This is actually Solitaire in this case. The end result is very fast visual symptoms developing to where those leaf material just starts to crunch up and be quickly necrotic is what it turns into. So just another example of herbicide symptomology. This is actually a mesotrione. It's an HPPD inhibiting herbicide. It actually impacts carotenoid biosynthesis. The carotenoids protect the chlorophyll from harmful UV rays, and without the carotenoids, the harmful rays from the sun can get in there and destroy the chlorophyll, and that's why you see these white plants develop. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about site of action, mode of action, when you hear those terms being used. If we talk about factors influencing herbicide activity or performance, improper weed identification. It can be a challenge. The good thing is there's a lot of good tools out there that can be used to help you in the identification process. A very common example would be crabgrass versus goosegrass. Goosegrass is becoming a bigger issue, especially if you're managing sports fields and things like that. Every now and then, you can see it in home lawns, but the same can be said from a home lawn standpoint when you're dealing with crabgrass and trying to figure out if it's crabgrass or foxtail or something like Johnson grass. Those are all these different weed species, grass species that can infest home lawns. It would be nice if every single grass herbicide would kill all grasses, but that's unfortunately not the case. Prime example with these two weeds, products that contain quinclorac are more effective on crabgrass than goosegrass. Standalone products with quinclorac, I should say. As you get into tank mixes or pre-mixes that contain other active ingredients, then you can be more effective on goosegrass. But how do we understand to do that? To understand what we're dealing with, that's if you don't know what the characteristics are that you're looking for, it can be difficult, and this can be a waste of time and money having to go back and retreat and do service calls. So we'll get into the differences here in a second. Plant size certainly can have an impact on the success of an application. Typically with a broadleaf weed herbicide and grasses in general, they're going to be more susceptible when they're in the younger growth stages than more mature growth stages. I would say that if you're in this situation and you have a customer that has a weed this tall, then I think there's other issues to be addressed. So keep that in mind if you have a 10-foot tall thistle plant in your customer's yard. So, but very important, application timing is very important, because there are certain times of the year where weeds are going to be more susceptible to herbicides than others, specifically with post-emergence herbicides. pre-emergence herbicides, I think there's a good understanding there of saying, okay, well, that product needs to go down prior to that weed emerging. Okay. And there's specific time frames to do that. As we're in the fall. Okay. If you're down south, you're thinking about, keeping those lawns clean as we're getting into a dormant phase. So what can we do, now to prevent that? We're still in the late early post timing for the general southeast. I would say outside of South Florida. I noticed somebody in Miami is on the call. So down in Miami, it's a 12-month season down there. But in general, in the mid-south, where the Bermuda grass goes dormant, that's what we're thinking about. Up here in the Midwest, if you're in a cool season environment, you got your last few applications going down, for broadleaf weed applications, especially dandelion, wild violet, those types of applications. So understanding when those times are going to be most effective is very important, especially dealing with troublesome weeds. This is an example of Kalinga control. As we try to tackle Kalinga control, this is another weed that's becoming a bigger issue in lawn care. Trying to control Kalinga in the middle of the summer, the peak of when that weed is really growing and really pushing out vegetative growth, is an uphill battle. But if we try to catch it at the earlier growth stages, it's a much easier way relative to applying it here. You're going to have better results as you get back in the earlier growth stages compared to the heat of the battle, let's say. So that's why certain times of the year are going to be more effective when you're talking about perennial weeds compared to annual weeds. Growth stages can be important. We talk about crabgrass. That's an area. A lot of the crabgrass products out there are very sensitive to growth stages as far as efficacy goes. Typically, the larger the plant gets, the harder it is, or the more of a nuisance crabgrass can become. Whether you're in a cool season environment or warm season environment, trying to target the earlier growth stages is going to be more effective than trying to get it when it's in these, this 3 to 5 tiller stage. Usually in this stage, 3 to 5 tiller, you're talking about multiple applications. You tend to have a little bit better success when you're getting these earlier growth stages. Also notice how small this 1 leaf and 2 leaf and even 3 leaf growth stage is. You're probably not going to see that unless you get down on your hands and knees. So understanding the biology of these weed species, where they are, is also going to be important as far as developing an effective weed management program. Calibration is very important. I'm sure you're aware of that. Rule of thumb is don't always assume that equipment is properly calibrated. I would suggest that you have regular checkups for equipment, making sure nozzles aren't clogged, making sure the booms are the correct height, hoses and everything are in good order and good shape, and you actually do a calibration to make sure that product is being properly applied, because you don't want to get out there on a customer's property and have something go wrong when you could have controlled that easily. So this is a simple example of a clogged nozzle or a boom being too low, where you have clean strips of Bermuda grass and crabgrass right in between. So these are the situations we want to avoid, and we don't want to have happen on our customers' lawns, right? So always double check your calibration. Always make sure that the volume is what you need, for specific applications. So, if you are putting a pre-emergence herbicide down that's a spray, make sure you have a high enough water volume to drive that down through the canopy. Same for insecticide applications. If it's a post-emergence application, make sure you're at the appropriate application volume and using the appropriate nozzles to get even coverage, because coverage is important from post-emergence applications. And water quality. This is something that a lot of time gets ignored, but water quality can have a big impact on how that herbicide behaves once it's sprayed. There are certain chemical families that are more susceptible to pH ranges than others. Typically, most of your pHs, or excuse me, herbicides are going to be effective in this pH. I would say 5 to 7 is where you would want to be. But there are certain classes of chemistry, as the pH increases, the solubility increases. The sulfonylurea herbicides are a prime example of that. Two things can happen when the solubility of a herbicide increases. One, it can be very effective on weeds, but also it could increase turfgrass injury. So if you're dealing with a chemistry that's needs to be in a specific range of pH, please pay attention to that. Sometimes they'll have specific language on the labels that will instruct you, say, hey, if you're above this pH, buffer it down to get it back into this range. Water hardness can have an impact, turbidity. If you're pumping water from an unclean source that has a lot of sediment in it, some herbicides can bind to that sediment, and that can impact how it performs. Glyphosate is a good example of how carbonates and bicarbonates can affect that efficacy. So just keep that in mind. There's simple things that you can do to check your water quality. Okay. So now we'll kind of go from, we've talked about just some basics of weed management and just the importance of weed identification, the importance of pulling everything together that you have, whether it be proper mowing techniques and all of that, into developing a management program. Now let's get into more specifics of weed identification and management. Again, these are just going to be examples of some weeds that you may face out there. Not going to cover everything because there's a ton of weeds out there. So your more common weeds that you find, of course, are large crabgrass or crabgrass species in general. Large and smooth crabgrass are probably the predominant species that you deal with from a country standpoint. Certainly, as you get down into Florida, you deal with India crabgrass and blanket crabgrass and things like that. But in general, Digitaria species, they're summer annuals. They tend to have a branched stems that root at the nodes. We saw pictures earlier of the growth stages, as you get into the tillering stages and develop that from the leaf stage. One thing that will separate crabgrass from some other weeds and that we pay attention to is the ligule. And the ligule is right in the area, kind of right here where this leaf pulls back from the stem. Okay. And sometimes that can be hard to see just by, with your eye. So if you don't have one, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm holding up a little hand lens. It's a 10x hand lens. They're fairly inexpensive that you can go buy, and that really helps you zone in on that ligule and see what type of ligule it is if you're in a bind. Because 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have a seed head to look at. So you're going to be relying on other identification characteristics. So I'd encourage you to get that if you know. But crabgrass species have tall membranous ligules. Large crabgrass is covered in hairs. You'll see some of these hairs right here up the stem. They also cover the leaf as well. That's going to be different than some other crabgrass species. Typically, you're going to have a seed head with 3 to 5 finger-like spikes that come up. They'll typically start developing, certainly as you get into the middle to the late part of the summer. You look at smooth crabgrass, very similar identification characteristics as large crabgrass. The biggest difference is that smooth crabgrass is going to be smooth. It's not going to have a whole lot of hairs. Sometimes you'll see, I try not to, really hone in on color of weeds, because depending upon the environment, the colors can be present or absent. But sometimes you can see a maroon type color around the nodes of smooth crabgrass. A lot of times you don't see that with large crabgrass. So those are kind of some differences, but they both have a tall membranous ligule. They both have a similar seed head and growth habit as you get into those types of species. So these are the most common species that you have in cool and warm season turf types. A lot of different crabgrass control products out there. These are certainly not all of them, but just an example of what's out there. There are certain mixtures that are out there that can do multiple things. Something like an echelon for crabgrass and sedge control. But then you have different modes of action. More and more these days, you're going to hear people talk about, some of the weed scientists, especially from universities, talk about HRAC codes. That's what these numbers are, and it basically means what herbicide family or what mode of action that they have in them. So a lot of these names you're familiar with throughout the process, but from a pre-emergent standpoint, these are what the single AIs are most commonly used for. You get into the post-emergence products, again, just some examples here, whether it be a solitaire that has sulfentrazone and chlorac in it, and you get into the cool season markets with some of the HPPD inhibiting herbicides with topramazone, mesotrione, and then your phenoxyprop type products as well. Always keep in mind that these post-emergence herbicides are going to be more effective. Excuse me. When the weed is smaller as opposed to larger. Okay. Goosegrass, I mentioned earlier, can be confused with crabgrass. This is another summer annual. It germinates later than crabgrass. Typically, it's about 3 to 4 weeks apart, depending upon your geography. But it does grow in clumps like this. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as silver crabgrass because of the center of this plant has a kind of a whitish silver look to it. It has a very flat stem. It's a folded vernation, or what that means is you may be able to see it in this picture here. It almost looks like the leaf blades are folded, or they're V-shaped coming off that stem. And that's a result of that very flat stem and folded vernation there. It's a little different type of ligule. It almost looks like an M, if you can see that. So it's a membranous ligule with, that's fringed at the top, but it kind of forms an M. That's going to help you really determine the difference between that and crabgrass. Crabgrass is not going to have this M pattern, and it's going to be much taller of a ligule. The other thing to watch out for with crabgrass and goosegrass is that goosegrass is going to be a flat stem. Crabgrass is going to be more of an oval to round stem. So you're going to be able to roll a crabgrass stem in your hands or in between your fingers, whereas with goosegrass, you're not going to be able to. This is one that likes compacted areas. And so that's one of the reasons why it's such a big problem on sports fields and things like that. Here's an idea of germination. Foxtail is another species that you can run across in lawn care. It does have typically, say for yellow foxtail, it has actually a hairy ligule instead of a membranous ligule. But look at the differences in soil temperature and how these germinate. I mentioned that there's about a month apart, and that really timing is very important. We go back to the application timing. You know, sometimes you'll have a product that's applied here for crabgrass, and you need to come back a little bit later on, 3 to 4 weeks later, if you have a big enough goosegrass problem to apply sequential application, you know, for goosegrass control from a pre-emergent standpoint. Oftentimes, especially if you're in a much longer growing season, a single application here at crabgrass timing is not going to carry you all the way through to pick up and provide effective control of these later germinating grasses. So keep that in mind if that's a problem for you. A lot of times people will still do sequential applications for crabgrass anyway. And if goosegrass becomes an issue, you know, look at other active ingredients to see how effective, you know, you can pick up goosegrass. Very similar type of look from a goosegrass standpoint. I think, you know, certainly from a warm season turf standpoint, revolver comes into play. You know, some of these, and always, you know, we always say check the label for specific turf types as well as use sites. You know, I realize that some of these may not be registered for lawn care use, so just be mindful of that before you use these products. But a lot of the same products that control crabgrass, they do have activity on goosegrass, but it's the timing that really matters. A couple of other options that you see for goosegrass and cool season turf, certainly topramazone is out there, and then phenoxyprop is one that can be effective here. So the benefit of something like an echelon, you know, the combination product here at that later timing is you pick up goosegrass control, but you also you pick up sedge control and extend your crabgrass control. So, and when I say sedge control, I mean yellow nut sedge and caliga. This is just an example of some work that was done a few years ago at NC State University, looking at combining modes of action. You know, we'll talk a little bit later about, you know, herbicide resistance management, but as we combine modes of action, you know, we're seeing more and more issues with resistance. Goosegrass is one of those weeds that this can happen to. We have 2 different modes of action providing very good, very effective control. So always keep in mind for that. You know, we are seeing cases where in lawn care now, or weeds that are common in lawn care that are becoming resistant to a certain herbicide groups. So I'll touch on that a little bit later on. Dandelion. This is a species that is very common. Realize that there's different species throughout the country, but this is one. It's a perennial weed. Notice how deeply lobed or toothed these leaf blades are. They point back to the center of the plant. That's a big indicator of the identifying characteristic of dandelion. Of course, the puffball and the big yellow flower is a big one as well. Typically flowers in the spring. The seeds are dispersed by wind and spread by foot traffic. If you have kids or grandkids, you know, they're the blowing of the wind and the kicking of the puffballs. That's another, probably the most common way that dandelion is spread, right? Broadleaf plantain is one that you see a lot, especially in cool season turf. This is a perennial with a short taproot. It has kind of a rosette growth stage or growth habit, if you will. And these oval shaped leaves are much different than some of the other plantain species. Typically, it'll produce this 1 or 2 stalks that come up with seeds on them. The leaves are typically smooth, and in some cases it can be an indicator weed for pH issues. But one thing I will say about indicator weed species is that just because that weed is present doesn't mean there's a secondary issue going on. You know, I think prime example would be spurge and nematodes. You know, you can have spurge out there, but just because you have 5 or 10 spurge plants doesn't mean you have a nematode problem. You know, you have to look at other issues and look at, you know, other sampling techniques and things like that to actually confirm those. But, you know, this is one of the species that we have out there that does like a certain type of pH to grow in, you know, alkaline pHs, for example. Wild violet's another big one that can be issues, you know, both in the transition zone and further north. It's a perennial that has these heart-shaped leaves, these purple flowers, sometimes blue flowers. They do produce rhizomes and timing. This is one where timing is very important as far as application goes. You're going to see a lot better control when you're timing these applications in the fall than you are in the midsummer. So this is one to keep an eye on if it's an issue. And it's just to get an example, this is an untreated area, and this is a treatment where a fall application was applied. This is the following June. So big difference. You know, if we were to try to make applications in June or July, we wouldn't see this type of control long term. Okay. Virginia buttonweed is one that's very common in warm season turf. It's a very aggressive, challenging perennial that can produce above and below ground seed pods. They almost look like little pumpkins. You know, this weed has alternate leaf arrangement. They do actually have square stems, and if you look closely enough, they'll have a ridge of hairs going along those ridges of that square. You know, and it does have a characteristic 4-petaled white flower. Dollarweed can be an issue, you know, certainly down through the coast, you know, the Gulf Coast up through the Carolinas. You know, this is a perennial that can be quite challenging to manage. You know, it has that kind of that roundish shape to it as far as a leaf shape goes. In the petiole, you see these white dots right in the center of these leaves. That's where the petiole's coming up, and it almost is creating like an umbrella. Okay, you know, that's kind of characteristic of its plant family. You know, the umbellata species, and can get quite aggressive. This is how mat forming it can be, because it does grow by rhizomes. Can really outcompete something like Bermuda grass and be issues in St. Augustine grass as well. So it really does thrive in poorly drained areas. So a lot of different broadleaf weed combinations out there. You know, this is just an example. There's a ton of different applications. You know, a lot of them use the phenoxy herbicides or the growth regulating herbicides to manage these types of weeds. One of the things that you can do as well, you know, from a resistance management standpoint, is take something like a quicksilver, add it to a 3-way herbicide, and see much better response for that particular weed. This is on ground ivy, but again, very effective control on ground ivy when combining the 2 active ingredients. You know, you get the speed of control, but it's a good resistance management standpoint as well, regardless of what broadleaf weed you're looking at. You know, we have grass-like species, so yellow nut sedge is one that is becoming an issue, of course, or continues to be an issue, I should say. This is one that you can find it in both cool and warm season turf. This one is a little bit more cold tolerant than purple nut sedge. Purple nut sedge is typically limited to the south, but yellow nut sedge comes up further north. The biggest identification characteristic of sedges is this 3-rank stem, triangular stem and 3-rank leaf arrangement. You know, we do know that this begins to emerge between soil temperatures, you know, around that 60 to 65 degree range. So again, timing is going to be very important with this particular weed. It does like wet soil. It produces tubers or nutlets. And sometimes, man, they just come in, they just make themselves at home, right? I mean, what do you think? I mean, the nerve of this weed to just sit there on your chair and just make himself at home. That's what you got to do. Is you got to disrupt this process. You can't make them feel comfortable. Okay, can't allow them to do that because they can get really aggressive if they're comfortable. Look at all this. This is underground. Everything that's been reproduced underground from this one yellow nutsedge plant. You have 3 daughter plants. You've got all these rhizomes. You've got all these tubers or nutlets being formed. This is how aggressive this weed can be. So when we talk about application timing a little bit later, you'll hopefully we'll see how important that is from a long-term strategy standpoint. Purple nutsedge, I like to call this the meanest of the sedge family because it is a challenge to control. You know, it certainly has the maroon colored seed heads, but oftentimes you don't have that in a lawn care situation. Very similar identification characteristics as yellow nutsedge. It does produce tubers and chains. One of the ways that you can determine the difference is if you have a newly formed leaf and trying to decide if it's purple or yellow. You know, typically yellow nutsedge is going to have that tapered leaf tip, whereas purple nutsedge is going to have more of a blunt shaped leaf tip or a blunt leaf tip. So that's one way to look, one thing to look for, but that in itself can be challenging as well. Typically, this is going to be a little bit darker green, you know, have a shinier color. This is more of a paler green, in my opinion. We've got the perennial kalingas that are becoming bigger and bigger issues in lawn care. This is green kalinga. The biggest difference between these and yellow nutsedge is one, the seed head shape. They're more of like a globe shape or oval shaped seed head, that they remain green until they senesce, but they produce rhizomes. They don't produce any tubers. False green kalinga is the same as another species that you find more in the northern climates. And the green kalinga is a little bit more south. They both try to emerge in that 60 to 65 degree temperature range, similar to yellow nutsedge and purple nutsedge. But this is a difference. You know, this is the rhizome that we see kalinga and the perennial kalingas being that produce. They have kind of a maroon tint to them in that the rhizomes, and that's how mat forming. That's how aggressive they can be, and they really can outcompete turf type. And this is a good example of that. This pale green strip you see right here, that's all kalinga. And just really has shaded out and outcompeted this turfgrass. Whereas yellow nutsedge is over here, it's more upright and it's kind of more sporadic. So much more competition coming from kalinga. And that's why it's becoming a bigger issue, especially in the cool season markets. There's a lot of products out there that are labeled for nutsedge and kalinga control. Two things that you'll note is that there are only 2 modes of action that are dominating this class as far as control products, and that's the sulfonylureas and the PPO inhibiting herbicides. There are differences though. So we talk about timing. You know, this is how we want to look at a very simplified version of shoot emergence and tuber production. We know it emerges back here, but we want to make sure that we're trying to target those applications before maximum tuber production occurs. So we want to disrupt that process. Remember, we don't want to make them, we don't want to get them comfortable. We don't want them to have that opportunity. So that's why we come in and when we get those temperatures that are 65 degrees of soil temperature that are consistent at that timing, then we come in with an application. Say, for example, this is Dismiss NXT, and the impact that it has at that timing on tuber mortality is amazing. You know, if this is the untreated compared to a treated, significantly reducing the overall viability of those tubers. And that's what we're trying to do is long term, you know, because this is a weed that you can have tubers 10 inches down into the soil. Most of them are in the top 6. But how do we over time minimize the production of new tubers, when we're talking about perennial sedge control. And so that's why, again, going back to application timing, it's so important when you're dealing with this type of weed. Okay. Lastly, I believe doveweed is another weed. We're seeing the kind of a march of weeds moving north. Doveweed is one that's starting to spread further and further north. This is one that is a summer annual. It's very creeping. It can be a very aggressive. If it's in St. Augustine grass, it looks a lot like St. Augustine grass until it starts to flower. It does root at the nodes, alternate leaf arrangement, and can be kind of, you catch it in the right light, it can be really shiny. Of course, it has those little purple blue flowers. Oftentimes you want to see effective products, but they, a lot of times they need two applications. So importance that you see a lot of different combination products here. Depending upon the turf type that you're dealing with, some of these may not be able to be used. This is just an example of one of those products. 2 applications of blindside at 28 days apart is very effective in this particular Bermuda grass setting. So that's what you hope to have. It is a challenge to manage, but if you stay on top of it with the post-emergence of herbicides that are effective, you can do a good job with this. And then lastly, the little blurb about herbicide resistance and management. You're going to hear more and more about this, as you go to your association meetings, because we're seeing buildup of resistance with certain weed species. Because over time, what's happening is we're using the same modes of action over and over and over again. You're selecting out for these resistant populations, and eventually what's happening is you have more resistant population than susceptible population. So that's why it's very important to rotate modes of action or using combination products. Those are the scenarios that can help you reduce the risk of herbicide resistance buildup. Especially with grass species, but with in the lawn care, there's been documented cases of 2,4-D resistant buckhorn plantain, plantain. There's been cases of spurge and sensitivities or resistance to sulfonylurea herbicide. So, making sure that we're managing our tools appropriately can help us in the long run. So please remember that. And, but first and foremost, we always want to make sure we're establishing competitive turf grass. That's your foundation, right? Making sure that we can correctly identify, what weed we're trying to control, where we can target our applications to where it's most susceptible to herbicides in its life cycle. Always check your equipment to make sure it's calibrated appropriately. We're making sure we're reading and following the label. And then if you don't know, there's a lot of people out there, good resources that you can ask to help you along the way. So hopefully that gave you a good understanding of things.
And thanks again for joining today. So on behalf of everybody at FMC, thanks and have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody.